Hello. The Divine Code reading for November 8th, pages 307 and 308. We're beginning a new chapter. Which parts of a living animal are prohibited to be eaten? Topic number 1. For Gentiles, the prohibition against consuming flesh removed from a living animal encompasses not only entire limbs, but also any meat severed from a living animal. The Rambam, the Laws of Kings 9:10 states, a Gentile is liable for a limb or meat of any size. This teaches us, A, this prohibition for a Gentile is the same whether eating a whole limb or only a piece of meat. And B, Gentiles have no minimum measurements for any amount of food that is to be prohibited. So even though the terminology is limb from a living animal, it would not be necessary to eat the entire limb. A limb simply refers to flesh that's been removed from a living animal in any quantity. The text, the biblical text, but flesh with its soul, its blood, you shall not eat. That's the source text for this halakha, Genesis 9:4. Does not mention a limb, even though the Hebrew term Abraham Akai literally means a limb from a living animal. The prohibition forbids eating any meat separated from a living land mammal or bird, so it does not apply when one swallows a whole small mammal or bird alive. And it's possible that a person might take a baby, a tiny baby mammal or a baby bird and just eat the whole thing. I guess if he's very hungry, without ripping it apart, and he just takes the whole thing in one bite. This is according to Rabbi Yehuda in Tractate Kulin 102b, according to the exclamation of Tosafot. This is unlike Rashi, who says there is a prohibition of Abraham Hakai does apply to swallowing a whole living bird. So Rashi, Rabbi Yehuda in the Talmud states that it does not apply to the small bird. Rashi would disagree, says it does apply to the small bird. And Rambam in the Laws of Forbidden Foods 4:3 rules like the Tosafot. So the Tosafot says that the Rabbi Yehuda the Prince would argue that it does not apply. And that's how the Rambam sees it, and that's the way it's described in the Divine Code. But apparently there's this other opinion, it's a strong opinion, that would argue that it's not, that a Gentile cannot eat a whole bird in one bite and be considered exempt from this. So there's still a question open there. Or there's a possibility to question it, I should say. Halakha number 2, topic number 2. Thus, the prohibition of Abraham Hakai includes a limb comprised of flesh, sinews, that's tendons, and bones, such as a pad or a foot, an organ that is entirely meat, the tongue, the spleen, or kidneys and such, the animal's fat and similar parts. The prohibition applies regardless of whether one suffers an entire limb or organ or merely a portion of one, and whether he ate the entire severed piece or only a part of it. And that's the Rambam, the Laws of Forbidden Foods 5:2. Unlike the case for Jews, this prohibition applies for Gentiles, whether the limb has sinews or bone within it or not, since Gentiles have no minimum quantities of forbidden food. Jews are only guilty of a sin of eating Abraham Hakai if they consume an entire severed limb. A Jew who eats only part of a severed limb commits a different sin, which is called eating treifa, torn meat. So in the Jewish halakha, there's this concept of treifa that doesn't exist in the non-Jewish halakha. Non-Jewish halakha, there's no issue of treifa. There's only the issue of the limb of a living animal. In Jewish halakha, there's this other category. So if a person eats part of the limb, he is committing treifa. But it's not counted against him as eating the limb of a living animal unless he eats the entire limb. That's for a Jew. For a non-Jew, any quantity would be considered the eating the limb of the living animal. Topic number 3. The prohibition of Abraham Hakai applies only to one who eats severed meat. But if one chews severed bones or sinews or swallows them, he is not liable to punishment, though it is not permitted, for it is not considered an act of eating food. Pre-Magillan Sifrei Da'at 62:1. The prohibition only exists when one benefits from the normal manner of eating. Furthermore, the verse in Genesis 9:4 says, "You shall not eat." So the normal manner of eating would not include bones and sinews, because bones and sinews are not normally considered eaten. Now, the marrow of the bone would be. They're talking about the hard part of the bone, or a sinew, which is this. It's not considered meat. It's not under the category of meat, and it's not under the category of something a person would normally eat. Therefore, even though it's forbidden, it would not have the full sin, the capital liability would not exist for a person chewing, like a person chewing on the hard outer part of the bone. It's only if the person eats something that is normally considered a meat, something that a person would normally consider eating. And that's because the biblical statement is, do not eat, and chewing on a bone is not considered eating. If one severs a limb in its entirety, the flesh, sinew, or bones, or a portion of it, he is liable to eating from it as long as it has some meat on it, even if the majority is comprised of bones and sinew and not fit to be eaten, provided that he ate at least part of the meat. If one separates the meat from the bones, he is liable only for eating the meat, but not for eating any bones or sinew. See the Rambam Laws of Forbidden Foods 5.3. One is, however, liable for consuming the marrow of the bones. See topic 2.7 below. That's in tomorrow's reading. So it's going to go into the discussion of the marrow in tomorrow's reading. So if there's a limb of a living animal and some of the limb of the living animal is bone, even if the majority of it's bone, but there's some meat on it, and he eats of the meat, that would be liable for eating the meat. A four-legged limb that naturally has only bone and sinew but no meat is forbidden as Abraham Hakai, but does not make one liable for punishment. See Tractate Chulin 128b, according to Rabbi Yehuda the Prince, Tractate Laws of the Sources of Ritual Impurities, 2:3. So if there's a piece of the shank bone, the end part of the leg, which has very little meat, and you get a piece, if a person gets a piece that has no meat, which is unlikely, but it is possible. There's no meat on it at all. If the person eats that's not considered limb of a living animal. Topic number 4. This prohibition applies to one who severs a limb from a body of a living animal, even though the act will cause the animal's death, provided it does not kill the animal immediately. So if he takes a part off the animal, some miscellaneous inner part that will lead to the animal. It's talking about the animal would die in the next month or the next year. He's going to die eventually from the damage that was caused, but not immediately. It won't be like an immediate death. It'll be a long drawn out thing that'll eventually catch up with the animal. If, however, removing the limb or organ directly kills the animal, that is an act of cutting off its head or removing its heart, it is considered as if the animal was slaughtered by this act, and the prohibition against eating meat from a living animal does not apply. Now, further in the book, I don't remember where it was. Further in this section on eating meat of the living animal, there is a question opened up. If the head is severed off an animal, does the digestive system and the lungs and that were disconnected for that moment, whether or not those items are considered limb of a living animal, that'll go into at this point. But right now, it's saying that the removing the heart or removing the head of the living animal, the heart and the head would be considered, or the heart or the head would be considered dead at the point that it's removed, and therefore those items would be allowed for eating. If a person were to eat the cow's heart or the cow's, there's a lot of meat on the head of an animal that would be permitted for eating, even if that was the way that the animal was killed, as long as the animal was killed by the action. Is the critical question here, versus a person that takes various organs out of the animal that causes the animal to eventually die. That there's a period of time involved, then it's not considered immediately killing. Only if it's immediately killing the animal. See, Khatkam Tizvi, chapter 74, gives the reasoning for this. As soon as the heart or head is removed, it is impossible for the animal to continue living. And again, this will be brought up later on, I believe, in a later chapter in the book. Topic number 5. If one cuts off the spleen, the kidneys, or any other internal organ or internal flesh. And Shock Uridea 62.5 of an animal while it is alive, and left the severed pieces in the cavity of the animal, they are considered to having been severed from the animal during its lifetime. If the animal is slaughtered, thereafter the organs severed previously become forbidden. So even if and this is similar to the question of the internal organs after the head is removed, but in that case, the idea is the head being removed kills the animal. Therefore, the action itself is the action of severing the limbs is considered the act of slaughter, and therefore the limbs would be permitted. In this case, if a limb is removed but left in the cavity, but it's technically severed, that limb is considered severed even if it stays within the cavity, and therefore this gets into the whole question of hanging limbs that I think is also handled in a little bit later, where a limb is dangling from the animal but kind of stays semi-attached, and whether or not that's considered whether that's considered limb severed from a living animal or if it's still part of the animal, but it's either way it's dangling. So what's the threshold there? In this case, the organ was severed. It's left within the body cavity. If it's severed by whatever the threshold is for that, but it's left in the body cavity, it's considered severed, and therefore after the animal was killed, it would still be limb of a living animal. Now, at that point, it's a rabbinic argument not to use it. It would not be a liability. It would not be a court liability issue, but it would be a rabbinic issue of not eating that limb. This will be explained in chapter 3. That's in the next. That's in a couple days. Once meat is placed in the category of Ever Makai, it remains forever. It remains forbidden to be eaten forever. And from what I understand, that's a rabbinic injunction against eating that meat after the animal's dead. If, however, one cuts off portions of a fetus, leaving them inside the mother's womb, and slaughters the mother, the portion of the fetus are permitted. And that'll be described more in chapter 5, which deals with fetuses and eggs. And fetuses are a totally separate category to understand, and they'll be discussed in more detail in chapter 5. See the Rambam, The Laws of Forbidden Foods, 5.9, and Shulchan Aruch Uridea, chapter 14. The fetus is partially an organ, it's partially not. It's in its own category. So it's not the same as if an organ were severed or cut up within and left inside the body. Yeah. Thank you.